I'm going to test you now. Last week, James finished our series on the Beatitudes. Can you remember which Beatitude it was? Can't hear you. Don't look at your notes. Okay. Is anyone going to shout it out?
Persecution.
Woo! Well done. We got there in the end. Yes, so James finished off with these words. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Yeah. And they are powerful words, aren't they? But if we're honest, they're not always easy to live by. Because following Jesus sounds wonderful. It sounds great when life is going well. But it's much harder to follow him when it costs you something. When you're persecuted for your faith, it's harder to follow Jesus when you are persecuted. It's harder to follow Jesus when it costs you something. So this morning I'm going to ask you to imagine something with me for a moment. Tomorrow's Monday morning, right? It's the beginning of the week. Everything starts on a Monday, doesn't it? Especially in our house. The diet always starts on a Monday, fails on a Tuesday, we start the following Monday. But our regular week starts on a Monday as well, doesn't it? So imagine that tomorrow morning you wake up, you get ready for your day as you normally do, and you make yourself a brew or whatever it is that you do in the morning routine, and then you leave the house. You walk out the door. And by lunchtime, your whole life has been turned upside down. Not because you've done something wrong, not because you've made a terrible decision, not because you've walked away from God, but actually quite the opposite, because you've done the right thing. Your life has been turned upside down because you've done the right thing. Imagine being told that as long as you compromise your faith, everything will be fine. Just keep your head down, don't make a fuss, go along with what everyone else is doing, and you will be fine. But if you don't do that, you'll lose your job, you'll lose your reputation, you could lose your family, you could lose your friends, you could lose your security, and you could lose your life. I want you to answer this question honestly in your own mind. It doesn't have to be answered to anyone else. But would you still trust God? Answer yourself that. If you was going to lose your job, lose your reputation, lose your security, lose your family, or maybe even your life, would you still trust God? Because it's easy to say yes when we're sat here comfortably in church on a Sunday morning, isn't it? It's easy to say yes when things are going well. But it's a lot harder to say yes when the heat is on. And well, actually that's the title of my message this morning, When the Heat is On. And it's not clicking on. So the title of my message this morning is When the Heat is On. There we go. And isn't that very apt since it's very hot today? I never planned the weather to come in line with my preach this morning, but there we go. That's what we have. So none of us mind following Jesus when life is easy, do we? We think it's great. Do you know what? We follow Jesus and life is great and everything's going swimmingly well. We don't mind singing Waymaker when the bills are paid. We don't mind saying that God is good all the time and all the time when everything looks fine. We don't, do we? In fact, we don't mind posting Bible verses on our social media pages or even sharing them on the church WhatsApp groups when life is going really well. But what happens when following Jesus actually costs you something? When following his ways, when listening to what he's directing you to do actually costs you something? When life doesn't go the way you prayed it would? When the answer that you've been believing for never seems to come to pass? When the future that you had planned suddenly begins to fall apart and life seems like it's slipping through your fingers. And before you know it, your life feels like it's getting hotter and hotter. In fact, the heat has gone up 7 times more hotter than it was originally. You know, most of us have been there in our lives, haven't we? We've all had those moments where The heat has been on. The pressure has come. And we've just looked up and we've just said, God, where are you? What are you doing in this moment in my life? God, I don't understand this. Is it just me, or have we all been there at some point in our life? Yeah. But I want to put to you this morning, what if God has a bigger purpose for those heated seasons in our life? What if he has a bigger purpose for those heated seasons? And so this morning, what I want us to discover is 3 important things about God when the heat is on. I want us to discover God's purpose, God's process, and God's presence. But to understand that, we've actually got to go right back to the beginning of the Bible. We've got to go right back to Genesis chapter 1. Because before there was ever suffering, before there were ever trials, before there were tears, before there was even sin in the world, God already had a purpose for humanity. He already had a purpose for creation. And that purpose was for us to reflect his image. It says in Genesis 1, verse 27, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them." Let's just reword that a moment. So God created you and me in his own image, and in the image of God, he created us. Just think about that. When God created human beings, when he created you and me, his intention wasn't just to fill the earth with people. His intention was to fill the earth with people who reflected his image. We were actually created to reflect the image of God. Now, when the Bible says that we're made in the image of God, it doesn't mean that we look like God physically. I know some of us do carry a family likeness. We carry a family resemblance. If you look at Eva, she looks like me. No, that's a joke. She's not my daughter, but everyone thinks she is. But if you look at, say, Brad and his dad, for example, he looks exactly like his dad. In fact, I can tell you what my husband is going to look like in 20 years' time. If you look at his dad, that's what I've got to look forward to.
Good-looking guys. Good-looking guys.
Well, actually, you can decide for yourself whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just going to leave it there. Probably best. But that's not what Genesis is talking about. In fact, the Bible tells us that God is spirit, and no one has ever seen God. God is spirit. No one has ever seen him. So being made in his image isn't about our physical appearance. It's about his character. We were made to reflect his character. We were made to reflect his love, his holiness, his mercy, his justice, his compassion. So how do we know what that looks like if no one has ever seen God? I guess you could say the answer is easy, and Paul answers that very question in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, because this is what he says. Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. In fact, he is the tangible, living expression of the unseen creator. So if we want to know what God is like, we just need to look to Jesus. Look at how he loves, look at how he forgives, look at how he shows mercy, and how he shows compassion. And God's purpose for us isn't just that we admire Jesus, that we could admire him from a distance, that we could say how good and how glorious is he, how amazing is Jesus. But actually, God's purpose is that we become more like him. Not that we just admire him, but that we admire him so much that we want to become more like him. That we reflect his character and we represent him wherever we go. But if that's God's purpose for our lives, to reflect him, then I've got an obvious question. Why don't we always do this? Because we don't, do we? We don't always do this. We don't do this because there's a process. Something happened along the way in humanity, and sin distorted that reflection. Instead of naturally reflecting God, we naturally started to reflect ourselves. And you don't have to look far to see that. In fact, think about it this way. I've got a good example for you. You don't have to teach a 2-year-old how to be selfish. We don't, do we? In the history of parenting, I don't think anyone has ever sat a toddler down and said, okay, little one, you know what? Today's lesson is going to be about 3 words. In fact, these 3 words are just 1 word, and we're just going to say it 3 times. Today's lesson is going to be about the word mine, mine, and mine. No, we've never done that with toddlers, have we? Because do you know why? Because we don't need to teach it them. They seem to have mastered it all by themselves. And if we're honest, we as adults are not much different. We're just cleverer at disguising it. We still like things our own way. We still struggle with pride. We still find it easier to forgive ourselves than we do to forgive others. And our natural tendency is always to put ourselves at the centre, to put me at the centre, mine at the centre. And that's exactly what happened as humanity turned away from God. The image that God intended us to reflect became distorted. And instead of reflecting Him, we started reflecting ourselves. Can I show you something this morning? A mirror. Most of us stand in front of one of these every single day before we leave the house. And some mornings, just a quick check, isn't it? Yep, everything's in the right place. Let's go. And then other mornings, well, it's a bit more like a negotiation with the mirror, isn't it? Like, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Please make me look better today. I'm feeling a bit rough. Yeah? You can't tell me you've not stood in front of the mirror some days and thought, could be some improvement there. But the thing about a mirror is that it doesn't have an image of its own. It just reflects whatever is standing in front of it. So, Brad, come and stand in front of the mirror. I'm just checking. Let me just check now.
Needs cleaning.
Yep, that's reflecting you. It's reflecting you. Are you going to do some muscle flexing or anything? Come on, Daz. Stand in front of the mirror. Come on. Can you see yourself?
It's all about Daz.
It's all about Daz. Eva, come on. Okay, looking great, Eva. You're looking great. Thank you very much. You see what I mean? You stand in front of the mirror, all it reflects is the person that is standing in front of it. A mirror doesn't decide what we see. It just reflects the truth of what is in front of it. And that's how we are created to live. Our lives were never meant to be about us. They were meant to reflect Jesus. They are meant to reflect Jesus. So if we are meant to reflect Jesus, then what we're supposed to do is keep Jesus at the forefront of our lives all the time, every single moment of every single day. But the truth is, a lot of the time, we just don't do that. And instead of people seeing His love, they often see our anger. Instead of seeing His grace, they see our pride. Instead of seeing His peace, they see our fear. So how does God restore the reflection? How does God restore His reflection in us? Well, the answer is that it's a process. And here's the good news. Jesus didn't come just to forgive us, even though that is good news in itself. But He came to restore His reflection within us. He came to restore us. And I wish I could tell you that becoming more Christ-like happens the moment that you say yes to following Jesus. The moment that you say to trust in him, that you pray one prayer, then you walk out of church, and suddenly you never lose your temper again. You never doubt again. You never struggle again. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be great? But that's not how it works. That's not how God works. And that's exactly what Paul means in 2 Corinthians 3:18 when he says this: we all are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is Spirit. Did you see that? We are being transformed. Not we have been, but we are being transformed, which means it's a process. The truth is that we're all still under construction. We're all a work in progress. And you know what? I'm thankful to God for that. That it means that I don't have to be perfect all the time, but I just have to work towards, it's a process, towards being more Christ-like. We are a work in progress, and little by little, step by step, we are becoming more like Jesus. I love that this is a full-length mirror. The reason I brought a full-length mirror and not just a small little compact mirror is because God isn't interested in changing just one little part of our lives. He's not interested in just working on one part of our lives. He's not saying, let's just work on your temper, or let's just work on your language. He wants every single part of us to reflect his image, to reflect the image of Christ. Our words, our attitudes, our relationships, our priorities, our whole lives. A full-length mirror shows the fullness of our reflection, and our whole lives should show the fullness, the reflection of Christ. Have you ever wondered why becoming more patient usually involves dealing with difficult people or difficult situations? Have you ever questioned that? I mean, wouldn't it be easier if God just downloaded patience into us overnight? You know, like when your phone tells you, oh, there's a new update, you can schedule an install while you're sleeping. Schedule it to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then it updates your phone while you sleep. Wouldn't it be great if that happened with patience? Like you go to sleep, you wake up in the morning, ping, notification. Congratulations, you've just installed Patience version 3000. Be fab, wouldn't it? Well, it doesn't work like that. Throughout the Bible, fire, heat, is often used as a picture of how God shapes his people. In Zechariah chapter 13, verse 9, God says, I will refine them like silver and test them like gold. Job even understood that. Job had a difficult life, didn't he? And he even understood that too. Even in the middle of his suffering, he said this, but he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. I wonder, could you be confident enough to say that when God has tested you, that you would come forth as gold? Peter says something similar. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, he says this, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer in grief and all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though we find that by fire, may result in praise, glory, honour when Jesus Christ is revealed. They're all talking about different things, but can you see the pattern there? Fire isn't there to destroy the gold. It's there to reveal it. The refiner heats the metal until the impurities rise to the surface so that they can be removed. And that's what God does with us, so that we can become more like Jesus. The fire doesn't create those difficult seasons. It simply reveals what's already there. Just like our reflection in the mirror, it only shows the truth of what's already there. And God doesn't expose those things in us to condemn us. He exposes them so that he can heal and restore his image within us. So that he can restore his image within us. Isn't that great? And that's why James writes in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." He's not saying we should enjoy suffering. He's saying we can find purpose in it, because God is doing something through it. I've found that some of my greatest growth in my life hasn't happened during the easy seasons. The greatest growth in my life has happened in the difficult ones. The seasons where I've had questions. Have I even done the right thing? The seasons where I've felt stretched. The seasons where things just haven't gone as I had planned them. And so, if the fire is one of God's tools for shaping us, then nowhere do we see this more clearly than in Daniel chapter 3. In Daniel chapter 3, there's a story of what happens when the heat is on. When following God costs you something, and when his presence becomes more real than it ever has, ever in your life before. Do you know who I'm talking about? I'm talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. During this time, King Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful ruler in the known world at that time. He was the king of Babylon, and he was known for his pride. He was known because he wanted to be worshipped. And one day what he did was he built a golden statue, and he made it law that whenever music played, everyone had to bow down to this golden statue. And they had to bow down and worship it. And if anyone refused, they would be thrown into the blazing furnace. One day when the music started, everyone bowed down and worshipped this golden statue except 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And because they refused, they were reported to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he came along and he gave them one last chance to bow. But the 3 of them confidently, boldly refused to bow down to this golden statue. And in fact, what they said was this: "Our God is able to save us, but even if he doesn't, we still won't bow. But even if he doesn't, we still won't bow." Have you ever been there in your life where you know God has told you to do something and everything seems to be against it? And you just think, but I know that God has led me in this direction. I know that God is telling me to do this. So I'm not going to bow to the distractions. I'm not going to bow to the naysayers. I'm going to trust God. Have you ever been there? I can imagine Nebuchadnezzar was furious. And as you read on this account in Daniel chapter 3, you read that he actually ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter, and he had the 3 of these young men thrown into this furnace. But then when he looked on and he looked into the fire, he was actually shocked, bewildered, because what he saw was 4 men walking around in that fire, and 4 men who were walking around unharmed. And it says that the 4th man looked like a heavenly being. The 4th man looked like a heavenly being. And so he ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come out of the fire. And when they did, the fire hadn't harmed them at all. Not a hair on their head was singed. Their clothes were not burnt. They didn't even smell of smoke. God had been with them all along in that fire. I can imagine Nebuchadnezzar rubbing his eyes. Hang on a minute, and saying to his men, "Hang on a minute, didn't we throw 3 men into that fire?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Well, why can I see 4? What was meant to destroy those 3 men became the place where they experienced God in a way that they had never experienced him before. They didn't compromise their faith, and they were ready to face the heat, even to die. Church, sometimes, you know what? God's greatest miracle isn't keeping you out of the fire. Sometimes God's greatest miracle is revealing himself right in the middle of it. And Daniel chapter 3 teaches us that God is present in the fire. When the heat is on, God is present. And not only is he present, but he stays with us until the process is finished. He stays with us. And he stays with us not because he is helping us to survive the fire, but because he's using it to finish his work within us. And that reminds me, just as I come to a close, of a story that I once heard of a group of women who were studying the book of Malachi. I think we may have even discussed this in one of our women's groups some time ago. These women met together regularly, and on one occasion they come to chapter 3 in Malachi. Chapter 3, verse 3, which says this: "He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver." After that particular Bible study, one of the women, she was intrigued and she decided to go and visit a silversmith to learn more about the refining process. She wanted to learn more about what that meant. And as she watched this man work, he explained to her that the silver must be held in the hottest part of the fire to remove the impurities. And then she asked him, "Well, do you have to stay there and watch the silver while it's being refined?" "Absolutely. Yes, I do need to stay there. Not only do I need to sit and watch it carefully, but if I leave it in the fire for even one moment too long, then the silver will be damaged." Right then, it hit her. The woman remembered that verse. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. What a beautiful picture of God. You know, when we go through difficult seasons, God doesn't walk away. He doesn't abandon us to the fire. His eye is constantly on us. He knows exactly how much heat is needed. He knows exactly how much time is needed. And he knows how long that process should take. And he knows exactly what he is doing. Before the woman left, she had one final question. How do you know when the refining process is complete? And the silversmith smiled at her and he said, "Well, that's easy. I know it's finished when I can see my reflection in the silver." What a powerful picture of what God does in our lives when the heat is on. What a powerful picture. Let me leave you with this. None of us know what this week will bring. For some of us, we might have a great week. And for others, it may be that, you know what, the heat is turned up in your life. Difficult circumstances come. We don't know what the future holds. But I want you to remember these 3 truths about God. That God has a purpose. That God has a process. And through it all, he promises his presence. Sometimes, church, the hottest fires become the very places where God meets us most clearly. And not only that, they can also be the places where we are formed and where the world sees Jesus most clearly in us. So remember, when the heat is on, God is still at work. He's restoring his image. He's refining our faith. And he's reminding us that we never face the fire alone. Amen.